Hello, this isn't just a normal video, it's a summer work video, but I've lost the sheet, so I can't actually remember what it said to do. I'm confident it said about Native Americans though, so I'm just going to do either just one or two videos on it to talk, but I'm going to try and do this quite condensed. It's like a quick fire Native American round, so enjoy. So the first thing to consider is that Native Americans weren't a homogenous group in the sense that every tribe was slightly different. So I think you need to be careful with generalising Native Americans as a collective group because they weren't necessarily. And more specifically, there's a lot of fragmentation and divisions among the different tribes. So a lot of them didn't get along. And also most of the Native Americans lived in the Great Plains, so the part in the middle of America, the hot part, the mostly inhabitable part. But Native Americans had ways that they could live on it and adapt. And there was the 5 civilized tribes, who I'll put the names on there because I'm going to say them wrong and everything. But they were more civilized in the sense that they were more aligned with white American values. So a lot of them had their own kind of government, constitutions, etc. So there wasn't much Native American resistance as a whole, as a collective, to white Americans moving in, mostly because they were fragmented anyway, the different tribes, so they couldn't really band together as a united front, which is what this Native American Tecumseh, that might be said wrong, I'm sorry, I'm trying my best. I am incredibly talented at saying things wrong, but I'll put the spelling there and it doesn't matter. But he preached rejection of white customs and wanted self-determination for the tribes. So wanted them to be able to be independent and live their own way without having any interference from white Americans coming in. So in 1811, he went to the south to try and persuade some of the 5 civilized tribes that I mentioned a minute ago to unite in a force of resistance against the white encroachment into the west. However, it ultimately failed because of the violence of the white American government in response. So William Henry Harrison, who was the kind of governor of the Shawnee Native Americans, I think, he launched an attack on their settlement and destroyed all the homes and the buildings and the food and the crops, etc. So it meant the Shawnees weren't really capable of fighting back because all their stuff had been destroyed, and it meant Tecumseh didn't want to threaten his tribe anymore. So that ultimately failed, and then the War of 1812 happened, and that's where he died. And I think with his death, it's almost symbolic of the end of Native Americans trying to unite together to be a resistive force against the whites. And also it meant that countries like Britain and Spain stopped aiding Native Americans after the War of 1812, so that further limited how Native Americans could even defend themselves against the white Americans coming in to the west. So now we can go through the Seminole Wars. So there was 3 that I'm going to talk about. The first one was in 1816 to 1819, but I don't think it's as straight as that, but anyway. So American forces under Andrew Jackson invaded West Florida, where the Seminoles were living, and he forced them to move out on a reservation to the centre. And again, there's lots of violence of them trying to resist being moved, but ultimately they ended up going to this centre reservation. But then in 1835, after the Treaty of Payne's Landing, which was in 1832, the Seminoles again were ordered to leave, but this time leave Florida completely, which again caused more violence. And there was guerrilla wars, which the Native Americans fought because it was the best mode of fighting for them, with having limited men, etc. Ultimately, American forces won by destroying all their farms, villages, all their crops, so they couldn't carry on fighting. And then most were moved to Oklahoma, which is where the new reservation was for them to go. But some managed to remain, which leads me on to the Third Seminole War, which was 1855 to 1858. And the federal government was determined to remove the last remaining Seminoles from Florida, again through attrition, so burning their homes, burning their crops. So it meant the Seminoles pretty much had to leave because they couldn't survive there anyway. And so most again agreed to be removed to Oklahoma. Next, we can look at the Dakota War. I think it's also known as Little Crow's War in 1862, which was the Sioux tribe, and violence ensued because they were getting their food supplies and everything from the federal authorities after treaties, which we'll look at in probably a next video. I think I'm going a bit slow, but anyway, but the federal government were very inept in providing these resources, especially because 1862 were at the start of the Civil War, and so naturally the Sioux were frustrated by this, and it ended up in violence, and 700 settlers were killed as a result of this. And then the federal government wanted to punish, I guess, the Sioux tribe for this violence, and so they lost their land and they were moved even further west to a reservation at Crow Creek. One of the more famous events in Native American against white violence was the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. This was the Cheney and the Arapaho. I might say it wrong, I'll write them on there if I edit this properly, we will see. They were moved further west to a reservation on Sand Creek, which again is to do with treaties, which we'll get into in another video. But the land they were moved onto was poor quality because it was further west. It hadn't been adapted yet, I guess. Like, the terrain wouldn't have been suitable, and so naturally they couldn't grow their own food. They weren't being given supplies because of the Civil War. So similar to what we've seen previously, they attacked the wagon trails for food, and then this again ended in violence. Their camp was attacked by militia forces again on the white American side, and 450 Native Americans were killed as a result of that. So next we'll look at Red Cloud's War, which is from 1866 to 1868, which is a violence to do with the Sioux tribe, and it was because gold was discovered in Montana, and so consequently you get the white Americans getting really excited about the gold, so they come in, try and dig it all up and everything because they're greedy. And then you also get the federal government who want to profit off this gold discovery, so then they start building trails along, which naturally breaks treaties which had been previously made with the Sioux. And so Red Cloud was one of the leading tribesmen of the Sioux at this time in this area, and so he waged war against the white Americans who were coming on their land, and he was very successful. He waged a winter campaign through the winter, which was difficult for the white Americans to sustain, and so ultimately he was victorious in this, and the US surrendered in 1868, and as a result the Great Sioux Reservation was established. This is probably the most famous battle we're going to talk about, and it is the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, and this was as a result of gold being found like Red Cloud's War. Can we see some correlations going on there? But because gold was found in the Black Hills of Dakota, which is where their new reservation was, which we'll look at with a treaties video. And then, so as a result of gold being found, miners quickly came in. These white Americans started encroaching on their settlement, which broke the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Yeah, I'm confident it was. And again, we'll get to that. But naturally, the reservation Sioux were unhappy about this, and as a result, a lot of them left, I think, their reservation, and would go outside of their borders, because, I mean, if the white Americans are coming into their reservation, then why can't they leave? And also, I think they need to hunt game and stuff like that if they're not getting the supplies they need. And as a result, Custer, who was white American military hero, but a bit of a dick, he attacked at Little Bighorn, which I'm assuming is a location. So the white Americans sent in Custer and his command. Ultimately, they were all killed because I don't think they... I watched a podcast on this ages ago. There's one on it in our time, but I can't remember now. But they were unskilled in how they did it. I think they went too quick. They were disorganised, and ultimately led to them all being killed. Which, I mean, you would think, great, the Native Americans were victorious, they won. But, I mean, no, because of the massive government response after Custer and his command had been killed. Obviously, they were frustrated by this and wanted to enact revenge, like it wasn't their fault for going on the land in the first place. But anyway, as a result, massive government action, the Sioux were forced to sell the Black Hills and move on to another reservation. And we'll get into the allotment policy soon, so there'll be an allotments by that point. The last act of violence against Native Americans we're going to talk about is Wounded Knee in 1890, and this was the Sioux tribe again, and it was as a result of something called the ghost dance, which was like a dance craze within the Native Americans, which they believed that it would like restore their land and their power and just everything that they had before the white Americans took it all. But I mean, this alarmed the white settlers because they thought it was like a dance to raise an army to kill the settlers or something. And then as a result of all this kind of hysteria, Sitting Bull, he was one of the main Sioux tribesmen, he was shot. And then again, naturally the Sioux are like really upset by this, and bands of Sioux fled their reservation to Wounded Knee, which was a place. Probably, it must be a place. And they were ultimately surrounded by the federal white American army, and then 200 Sioux, men, women, children, were brutally killed. So now we can move on to treaties. So just a few quick ones at the start. We have the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814, which was after the War of 1812, which the Creek tribe were involved in, fighting with the British against the white Americans, and so as a result of the American victory in the war, the Creeks ceded 2/3 of their land to America. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was set up in 1824, which its role was to oversee treaty negotiations, but then later it had more of a focus on civilizing the Native Americans through the allotment policy and then reservation policies prior to that, to try and dismantle tribal government and just dismantle the Native American way of life. You can't see, but my cat's right here. Bella! Come on, Bella. Oh, I think she's camera shy. That's okay. The first big treaty was the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which was by Andrew Jackson, and he essentially granted himself the power and the funds to move Native American tribes further west, again to make room for westward expansion, and he guaranteed them this land forever and said, we won't take it again and we won't break this treaty. Spoilers, they take the land and break the treaty. But Jackson ultimately argued that this treaty was in the best interests of Native Americans because it was kind of described as some sort of haven where they could live out their tribal customs and not be aggravated by white Americans, and obviously then they wouldn't have to be subjected to kind of white American customs, I guess, so I don't know, capitalism. This ended up with having 94 treaties within it, so with the individual tribes, and by 1835 it was declared, probably by Jackson, declared a success in the sense that it moved the tribes west and it was all happy days. It really wasn't happy days, but specifically within looking at the Indian Removal Act, you can look at the influence it had on the Cherokee tribe. So they were unwilling to move from Georgia, which is where they lived, as a result of the Indian Removal Act. Who wanted to move them out of Georgia because they were one of the civilized tribes. They were largely assimilated into Georgia. They had their own constitution, that's what I'm looking for. They had their own constitution, their own government. They were very adopted into white society, and then this ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and they argued that the Cherokee were justified in wanting to stay in Georgia, and they were this is difficult, a nation within a nation, so they should be allowed to stay in Georgia under their own kind of rules and their own regulations and not be subjected to being moved west. But ultimately this ruling wasn't enforced because I don't think Georgia was prepared to enforce it properly, and they had no support from Jackson or the central government, and so ultimately they were pressured into signing the Treaty of New it will be there, 1835. But then, even though this was signed, it was only signed by a small majority of the Cherokee, or only a small majority supported it. So although 2,000 voluntarily left Georgia, many stayed because it was their home, but ultimately they were forcibly evacuated, and then this led to the Trail of Tears in 1838, which is kind of a metaphor, I guess, for them having to move further west, being upset and despair about it because they've been kicked off their rightful homes to move to a place that was probably inhabitable. 4,000 died on the journey because of the treacherous weather, etc., and it was 1,200 mile journey. So, naturally. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, the first one, spoilers, the second one, was signed in 1851, which was for 9+ tribes, so quite a few tribes, and it essentially began reservation negotiations. And so the government agreed the rights of the tribes would be protected. Ironic, they would not be. But the idea was that the Native Americans in these reservations would guarantee safe passage to white settlers, but obviously not having them stay, so it's kind of a mutual agreement. But in return, the government would pay these tribes in the reservations a sum, like an annual sum, which meant, yes, they were being given resources, I guess, but it meant that they had become almost entirely dependent on the federal government. So that's going to cause problems, as we saw before with the Sand Creek Massacre, like when tribes aren't given the money and the food which they were promised in previous treaties.